Story 1: The Abandoned Car and the Whisper at the Gas Station. I've always been a man who loves the open road. Since I was 23, I chose the life of a trucker, crisscrossing the United States from end to end. I've had many curious and strange experiences during those long nights on the job, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that fateful night. It all began as an ordinary workday. I had to deliver wooden furniture to a company on the other side of the state. The load was heavy, and the journey would be long, so I was ready to spend the entire night on the road. Due to a mistake, I ended up leaving late and soon realized that most of the trip would be in the dark. I knew I'd have to drive through deserted roads, in the middle of the vast desert, where nothing but silence and darkness would keep me company. Desert roads are long and straight, perfect for making good time. Since the road was completely empty, I accelerated more than usual, trying to make up for the delay. The stars in the sky were dim, and the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds. The only light I had came from my truck's headlights, cutting through the darkness ahead. The desert was vast and desolate, and all I could hear was the engine's hum and the wind, which seemed to whisper ancient secrets around me. As I sped down the road, something unexpected happened. In the distance, I saw the faint glow of flickering lights. As I got closer, I realized they were the taillights of a car stopped on the shoulder. My heart started to race, and I slammed on the brakes, feeling the truck's weight resist as it slowed down rapidly. Finally, I managed to stop and parked behind the car. The vehicle appeared to be one of those old models, with hazard lights blinking intermittently. I got out of the truck, feeling the cold desert air wrap around my body. Curiosity and the desire to help took over me. After all, in such solitude, it was common for truckers to lend a hand to one another or to any traveler in trouble. I approached the car and knocked on the driver's window. There was no response. I leaned in to peer inside, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The windows were so dark that I could barely see the interior of the vehicle. I did the same with the other windows, trying to see if anyone was inside, but the car was completely empty. The wind was softly whistling, and I began to feel a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Looking around, all I saw was the vast, cold, and hostile desert. The darkness was so deep that my vision didn't extend more than about 50 feet ahead. The feeling of being watched grew more intense. I decided I needed to help somehow, so I returned to the truck and grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox under the passenger seat. It was a tactical flashlight, with a beam so strong it could blind someone if pointed directly at their face. As soon as I turned on the flashlight, a new detail emerged before me. Beside the road, something I hadn't noticed before, an abandoned gas station. The structure seemed to have been swallowed by the desert sand, which explained why I hadn't seen it initially. The flashlight's beam revealed an old, dusty, and neglected building. Apparently, the station had been a convenience store in the past, but now, all that was left was a shadow of what it once was. I decided that the car's owner must be inside the station, perhaps looking for something or waiting for help. With the flashlight in hand, I approached the building. The front door was broken, hanging from one hinge, and the whole place exuded a sense of abandonment and desolation. The flashlight illuminated the store's interior, and I could see empty shelves and dust accumulated in every corner. The walls were stained, and the silence was so absolute that each of my steps echoed back to me, amplifying the feeling of loneliness. I called out to see if anyone would respond. "Is anyone there? I'm here to help." The sound of my voice echoed through the empty space, but there was no reply. The echo reverberated off the walls, sending a shiver across my skin. Then, something changed. A sound broke the silence, a faint noise, like the sound of a shoe scraping against concrete. It came from the other side of the store, behind some shelves that were probably once filled with drinks or snacks. My heart began to race, and my breathing grew heavy. I called out again, asking if anyone needed help. But this time, the answer I received wasn't something I expected. A whisper, deep and heavy, filled the air, as if someone was right next to me. "Leave." The sound was clear, but its intent was unclear. Why would someone say that? And why in such a way? The heavy breathing that followed the whisper seemed to come from one of the dark corners of the place. It was enough to make me quickly back away. Without thinking twice, I started to walk backward, toward the door. My legs were shaking, and fear began to take hold of my body. Everything in me was screaming that I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. As soon as I reached the door, I turned and ran back to the truck, feeling like something was chasing me. Even though I was outside again, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. The darkness around me seemed alive, as if it was hiding something that shouldn't be seen. Back in the truck, with trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I was so scared that I could barely speak. I told them where I was, or at least where I thought I was, because at that moment, I wasn't exactly sure of my location. All I could say was that I was next to an abandoned gas station, on some road in the middle of the desert. The police asked me to stay on the line while they tried to track my location. But then, something even stranger happened. The car in front of me, the one I thought was abandoned, suddenly started and began to speed down the road. I was stunned, unable to believe what I was seeing. Whoever was in that car had managed to get in without me noticing. Maybe I had been so distracted by the call that I didn't realize. Disoriented, I got out of the truck once more, still on the phone with the police, and ran back to the station to see if anyone was still inside. This time, I went straight to the back of the store, where I had heard the voice and the breathing. Fear had already turned into a mix of adrenaline and urgency. The flashlight was shaking in my hands, and each step seemed to echo louder than the last. When I finally reached the spot where the sound had come from, my heart nearly stopped. On the floor was a pool of fresh blood. The blood gleamed under the flashlight's beam, and for a moment, I was completely paralyzed. Everything indicated that something terrible had happened there. The scene before me was enough to make my mind imagine the cruel details of what might have occurred. I got back on the phone and told the police that I had probably witnessed a crime. The police arrived quickly, sending several patrol cars to the scene. They began investigating, asking questions about the car, the suspect, any detail I could provide. But besides knowing that the car was old and dark in color, and that I had heard a male voice telling me to leave, I didn't have much more to offer. I also mentioned that as I was leaving, I had heard a woman scream, but there were no bodies there to confirm that. The police collected some evidence and blood samples, but I knew that, unfortunately, my contribution to the investigation would be limited. The following week, the experience still weighed heavily on my mind. I decided that I wouldn't go through something like that again without being prepared. I went to an electronics store and bought a dash cam for my truck. Maybe if I had had a camera that night, things would have been different. This experience, though unique in my life, left a mark that I still carry with me. The desert roads, which were once just a part of my job, now bring back memories of a night I will never forget. The silence, the darkness, the whisper, it all still echoes in my mind, and every time I think about it, I feel like this story will haunt me for a long time to come. Story 2, The Long-Necked Man on the Road. 3 years ago, I worked as a truck driver for a warehouse company. The job was tough, but I was used to the routine of long hours on the road. Back then, deliveries weren't just a way to make a living, they were a part of me. Each trip was a new opportunity to explore the highways, to challenge my limits, and to lose myself in the solitude of the night. It was a freezing Monday in April, and the week was just beginning. The clock showed 3 in the afternoon when I climbed into the cab of my semi-truck, ready to face another long journey. The destination was far, but I was determined to get there that same night, without any stops. I'd done it before, and I was confident I could do it again. The load was heavy, but the truck was in perfect condition, and I was prepared for the challenge. As the hours passed, night fell quickly, bringing with it a biting cold. The road ahead was deserted, and the only light guiding me was from my headlights. The dark asphalt seemed to stretch endlessly before me, and the absolute silence of the surrounding desert was broken only by the constant hum of the engine. I was alone, completely alone, with only my thoughts for company. It was past midnight, and the monotony of the road began to weigh on me. Fatigue started to set in, and my eyes grew heavier. I knew I was taking a risk by driving in this condition, but the desire to finish the journey without stopping pushed me to continue. The road was completely empty, and I began to increase my speed, driving 10 kilometers per hour over the limit. I knew it was risky, but I was so close to my destination that I didn't want to waste time. Then something unexpected happened. I was about to take a sip of water from my bottle when, suddenly, I saw a shadowy figure on the road at a considerable distance. The surprise was so great that I nearly spat the water onto the steering wheel. I immediately slammed on the brakes, and the truck began to slow down rapidly. As I got closer to the figure, I began to make out its details. What I saw still gives me chills to this day. A man was standing in the middle of the road, dressed in black clothes and wearing a scarf of the same color wrapped around his neck. But what caught my attention the most, and made me uncomfortable, was his neck. It was abnormally long, almost grotesque, something that didn't seem human. His face, however, was a blur, with no discernible features. It was as if his face was covered by a dense shadow, hiding all the details. The truck continued to slow down until it almost came to a complete stop, and for a moment, I thought about rolling down the window and asking if he needed help. But before I could make any move, the man abruptly turned to the left and dashed toward the forest lining the road. The speed at which he moved was surprising, almost superhuman, and within seconds, he disappeared among the trees. At first, I was so shocked by what I saw that I didn't know how to react. I accelerated again, trying to leave that bizarre encounter behind. But as the truck gained speed, my heart began to beat faster, and a feeling of dread started to settle in. What had I just seen? Was it real? Or was it just a hallucination caused by extreme fatigue? My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, and I felt my body tense, as if I were on high alert. The silence of the road, which had once been a comfort, now seemed threatening. Every shadow cast by the headlights ahead made me imagine the worst. My mind, once focused on the destination, was now filled with thoughts of fear and confusion. And then, as if the night hadn't yet revealed all its terror, something else happened. 5 minutes after the first encounter, while I was trying to regain my composure, I saw something moving quickly on the road ahead of me. At first, it seemed like an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, running toward the forest. But as I got closer, I realized it had a more human form. Again, I couldn't clearly identify what it was, but the feeling that I was being pursued by something supernatural took hold of me. This time, I didn't slow down. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, determined to get off that road as quickly as possible. I didn't want to know what that figure was. I just wanted to reach my destination safely. But as I tried to increase the distance between myself and whatever was on the road, the fatigue began to weigh even more. My eyes were struggling to stay open, and several times I drifted into the other lane without realizing it. I knew I couldn't continue like this. I was exhausted, and the road seemed to stretch on infinitely. I wasn't sure if I could finish the trip without stopping, so I started looking for a place to rest. It didn't take long before I spotted a small dirt turnout by the side of the road, one of those improvised rest stops for drivers. I decided it would be the perfect place for a quick break. I pulled the truck into the dirt area, set the parking brake, and reclined the seat, trying to relax. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. My heart was still racing, and the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me alone. I ended up falling asleep, but not for long. Less than an hour later, I suddenly woke up with a start. I don't know what woke me, but the first thing I did was look around. The darkness of the desert seemed even more oppressive, and my instinct told me to turn on the truck's headlights. When the lights came on, they illuminated the area in front of the truck, revealing a figure that made my blood run cold. There he was, the same man I had seen on the road, now standing right in front of the truck. But this time, I could see his face clearly. He had an eerily wide smile, almost splitting his face in half, and his eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. The sight was so disturbing that I felt my stomach churn. For a brief moment, I was paralyzed with fear. It was as if my body refused to obey my brain's commands. But then, the survival instinct kicked in. With my heart pounding so fast it felt like it would explode, I started the truck's engine and slammed on the accelerator with all my might. The truck lurched out of the rest area, kicking up dust and rocks as I fled from that place. As I sped down the road, my mind was in total chaos. How was it possible that this man had followed me for so many miles? And more importantly, what did he want? There were no answers to these questions, only a growing fear that told me not to stop until I reached my destination. The rest of the journey was a blur of adrenaline and terror. I didn't see anyone else on the road, but the feeling of being followed never left me. Finally, when I arrived at my destination, I parked the truck and collapsed from exhaustion and nerves. I slept in the parking lot, physically and emotionally drained. The next morning, I woke up to the sunlight streaming through the truck's window. The fear from the night before seemed less tangible in the daylight, but the memories were still vivid in my mind. I tried to rationalize what had happened, convincing myself that it was all just hallucinations caused by extreme fatigue. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen felt terrifyingly real. In the days that followed, the image of that man with the abnormally long neck and the macabre smile never left my mind. I told the story to a few trucker friends, but many said I was probably just too tired and that my mind had played tricks on me. Maybe they were right, but the feeling that something sinister had happened that night never left me. Since then, I avoid driving on deserted roads at night, especially in the areas where I encountered the mysterious man. Every time I think about it, I feel a chill run down my spine, and a part of me fears that someday, I might encounter that figure again. Story 3: The Strange Delivery and the Person Hidden in the Closet. In 2012, I was 24 years old and trying to establish myself after graduating from college 2 years earlier. It wasn't easy to find a stable job that paid well, so when the opportunity to work as a delivery driver came up, I grabbed it without a second thought. The pay was reasonable, and although the job was tiring, it allowed me to pay the bills and have a bit of independence. But like any job, there were days that were harder than others, and some moments, in particular, were simply terrifying. At that time, I worked from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., which meant that, especially in winter, I finished my shift under the darkness of night. This, combined with the nature of my work, led me to frequent areas I would normally avoid. The city where I lived wasn't the best, and many of the deliveries I made were in neighborhoods that were far from safe. That particular Wednesday was one of the coldest days of the year. Winter was at its peak, and the icy wind seemed to cut through my skin whenever I stepped out of the truck. I had spent the entire day making deliveries in 3 different small towns, each with its own quirks. It was a methodical job, following routes mapped out to optimize time and fuel. However, it was nearing the end of my shift, and I was eager to get home. As the clock approached 6:30 p.m., I found myself in one of the most isolated and uninhabited areas of the city. The street I was on was a mix of small houses and shacks, spaced far apart, giving the place a desolate appearance. On one side of the street, there were only trees and dense bushes, creating a sort of forest that seemed to hide dark secrets. The wind blew strong, making the tree branches sway and cast strange shadows on the asphalt. I was exhausted, but I still had one last delivery to make. The house was at the end of a long, poorly lit street, and to my frustration, the package had to be signed for by the recipient. I couldn't just leave it on the porch and leave. When I finally found the house, it turned out to be a small, isolated structure, more like a shack than a house. There were no lights on inside, and no car was parked out front, making me doubt if anyone was really home. I parked the truck in front of the house, got out, and went to the back to retrieve the package. It was the largest and heaviest box I had carried that day, and the sound of metal pieces clanking inside echoed in the quiet of the night. Whatever was inside, it was big and heavy. Struggling with the box, I walked up to the door and knocked, hoping someone would answer quickly so I could end my day and go home. After a few seconds of silence, I saw a curtain move in the window next to the door. I heard soft footsteps approaching, and then there was a long pause, as if the person was hesitating to open the door. When the door finally opened, an older woman with gray hair and a suspicious expression appeared. Her eyes were restless, almost paranoid, as if she was expecting something or someone. I explained that she had a package to sign for, and after a brief hesitation, she finally opened the door completely. The woman seemed frail and nervous, and her hands trembled slightly as I handed her the electronic device to sign. The signature she left was poorly done, almost illegible, but what worried me most was the environment around me. As soon as I stepped into the house, I was greeted by a strong and unpleasant odor. It was a rancid smell, hard to describe, but it certainly came from something decaying or very old. The house was poorly lit, with dim lights that barely illuminated the small living room, where old and dusty furniture was arranged haphazardly. The place had a heavy atmosphere, as if it was trapped in time. The woman, noticing the difficulty I would have carrying the box alone, asked me to help her carry the package to the bedroom. Although I felt uncomfortable, I didn't feel it was right to refuse, so I followed the woman down a narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. With each step I took, the smell grew stronger, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. We reached the end of the hallway, where the woman opened the door to a room. The place was almost completely dark, except for a faint light seeping in from the living room. When I asked her to turn on the light, she replied that the bulb was burned out, making me even more uncomfortable. The room was full of shadows, and I could barely see where I was stepping. Carefully, I began to carry the box into the room. The woman asked me to place the package inside a closet at the back of the room. The environment was suffocating, and the lack of light made it difficult to see anything. As I slowly moved forward, straining my eyes to see better, something at the back of the room caught my attention. As I approached the closet, I noticed a dark silhouette moving in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but it soon became clear that someone was there. It was a human figure, motionless, but with a posture that made it clear they were trying to hide. My heart raced, and my blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they were hiding from me, and it certainly wasn't for a good reason. With adrenaline surging through my body, I let the box fall to the floor and began to back away. Fear took over, and the only thing on my mind was getting out of that place as quickly as possible. As I retreated, I passed the woman, who tried to call me back, her voice growing more shrill and desperate. She even started cursing at me, but I didn't listen. By this point, my only concern was my safety. I quickly exited the room, crossing the narrow hallway with long strides. The strong smell that permeated the place seemed even more oppressive now that my fear had turned into panic. The woman continued to shout, insisting that I come back, but I was already in the living room, just a few feet from the front door. Without looking back, I opened the door and ran outside, where the cold night air hit me like a bucket of ice water. I jumped into the truck and slammed the door, breathing heavily. My heart was still racing, and I felt my whole body trembling. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could, leaving that house and that woman behind. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house's door slowly close, as if the woman had finally given up on calling me back. But even though I was a good distance away, I couldn't shake the image of that person hiding in the closet. Who were they? And what were they planning to do? Finally, when I felt safe enough, I pulled into a well-lit gas station to catch my breath and try to make sense of what had happened. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, but the feeling of imminent danger was still there. The bright lights of the station gave me a false sense of security, but I knew something very strange and dangerous had happened in that house. I didn't go back to finish my shift that night. Instead, I drove straight home, still processing what I had just experienced. The next morning, when I woke up, I realized I couldn't continue with that job. The experience of the previous night had shown me that I was exposed to risks that weren't worth it. I decided I needed to find a safer job, something that wouldn't put my life in danger. In the days that followed, I told the story to a few colleagues, and while some thought I was exaggerating, others warned me that strange things happen in isolated areas and that I had probably escaped something much worse. I never found out what was really happening in that house, and maybe it's better that way. Since then, I've never gone back to that area, and the memory of that night remains etched in my mind as a reminder that not everything is as it seems. Sometimes, the simplest deliveries can hide the greatest dangers, and the darkness that inhabits certain places is not just the absence of light, but the presence of something more sinister.